So we learned about custom widgets, a super important feature you're going to use all the time when working with Flutter. Now there's one thing you can do with custom widgets that makes them even more powerful, but before we can explore that thing, and before we then thereafter can come back to this app and add more features to that, we have to dive into variables. So what are variables? Variables are data containers, and this feature exists in basically all programming languages, because it turns out that in all programming languages you're working a lot with values, like also here, where in our styled text we have some text, or basically everywhere else we have a bunch of widgets and configuration objects, which are of course also all values. Now to understand variables, let me go back to the gradient container here. And here we could say that maybe these alignments, which of course also are values, should not be stored here in this part of the code, which is hidden quite a bit inside of the widget tree, but maybe we want to define them up here at the beginning of the file so that if we ever want to change these alignments, we can do it right here at the top of the file without having to dive into our widget tree. This is of course just a convenience thing in the end, but the more complex your code and project gets, the more little tweaks like this could help. To do this, we could cut the value from down there and instead store it in such a variable, because variables, as you learned, are data containers. In Dart, they are created with help of the var keyword, then the equal sign operator, the so-called assignment operator, and then the value that should be stored, for example, a string. So here, if I want to store this alignment value, I could create a variable here outside of my class. We can also create it inside of the class, but for the moment, let's do it outside. Then give it any name of your choice, like for example, start alignment. The name is up to you, but just as before with other names, it should not be separated into multiple words. Instead, words inside of words should start with an uppercase character. But unlike class names, the overall variable name should start with a lowercase character, so it should follow this naming pattern. And the name should describe which kind of value will be stored in that data container, in that variable. And then we assign the value with an equal sign, in this case alignment top left, for example. So that's how we could define a variable. We could then add a second variable, and that is this end variable. So therefore, I'll name this one end alignment and store alignment bottom right in there. And with those two variables added, we could use them down there to assign start alignment as a value to begin, and here end alignment as a value to end. Though here you will notice that I'm now getting an error, that a value of type null can't be assigned to a parameter of type alignment geometry. This is a bit cryptic to understand though. What does it mean? Well, variables, when created with the var keyword, which we're doing here, can actually be reassigned. Here I'm assigning an initial value, but I could then change that value. For example, here in the build method. Here I could set start alignment to alignment.center. That's a core mechanism of variables created with var. You can reassign them. Now that's in the end where this error is coming from. This null part can be confusing, but it actually also tells us that the const keyword seems to be the problem, that we might want to remove this const keyword. And here it's referring to this const keyword in front of box decoration, since if we add const here, it's also implicitly added to linear gradient, and that is the object that takes begin and end. Since the values of these variables could be changed, it's not guaranteed to be stable, it's not guaranteed to be constant. And that's exactly the kind of problem we're facing here if we do have const in front of linear gradient or box decoration. We can't tell Dart that it can cache and reuse that value because actually these variables are not locked in. They could change potentially, and therefore reusing this value would be unsafe because Dart might accidentally reuse an outdated value, which is why you can't use const here then. You could add it in front of this list still, since these colors are indeed locked in place here and hard-coded here. But that's the idea behind variables. We simply have data containers that store values, and we can define them once and then use them multiple times wherever we want later in our code, as long as that code has access to the variable, which here in this case is the case.